keeping track of time?
I read that.
All right, so the last time we left young Prince Siddhartha, he was getting ready to renounce the life that he had been raised in, the life of essentially a prince of a small, you might say kingdom, but actually probably a republic that had a chief or a king at the head of it, and that would have been Siddhartha's father, Suddhodana. And it was the Republic of the Sakyas, the Sakya clan, which is why he's sometimes referred to as Sakyamuni, or the sage, or you might even translate it as the silent one of the Sakyas. He was getting ready to renounce this life that his father had built for him, a life of pleasure, of knowing no sickness, no old age, no death, this illusion that his father had built around him. And that's where we're going to pick up, is from that point in his life as he's leaving. But before we do...
How old was he when he left? When
he was
physically left?
He was 29 years old when he left, yeah. So we're gonna pick up with that. But first, I wanted to say a word about our sources and about language. First, about the language. Buddhism, as it has kind of made its way to the West, as it's made its way to America, has brought with it Sanskrit terms. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. There are some later Buddhist manuscripts, texts, that are written in Sanskrit, but the earliest ones are not. It seems like perhaps because Hinduism made its way to the West first, or was brought over to the West in a sense first, and these terms in Sanskrit became familiar in the West. Maybe that's why the terms in Buddhism were kept in Sanskrit. But actually, the language of the earliest sources, the language of the oldest scriptures in Buddhism, are in a language known as Pali, not Sanskrit. And the Theravada school of Buddhism, the Theravada Sangha, that's the older, you might say the more traditional form of Buddhism. It's also the smaller one. There's not as many adherents of that form of Buddhism as say, the much larger Mahayana. But we'll get to all of that later. All of the Theravada texts, the Theravada scriptures, are in Pali, not in Sanskrit. And their scriptures are known in Pali as the Tipitaka, or in Sanskrit as the Tripitaka. And this just means the three baskets. That's because of the way that they're arranged. I want to, just like you, I've heard my entire life the Sanskrit more than the Pali, and so it's natural for me to call, for example, him Siddhartha Gautama, rather than the Pali Siddhartha Gautama. But I want to try and, out of respect for that tradition, if I can catch myself, use the Pali instead of the Sanskrit. And some of the differences will be, for example, you've now heard through our class on Hinduism, talk about the Dharma and about karma. These in Pali are Dhamma and Kama, so not exactly the same. You can hear that there's definitely a similarity, right? Pali comes out of Sanskrit, but is a different language. At the time of the Buddha, the Sanskrit was the language of the Vedas. It was the language that the Brahmins used in rituals and in learning. It was a language of religious rituals and of scholarship, but it wasn't the language that was spoken by the people, just like it isn't now, you know. And so I don't think Pali was the language that the Buddha spoke. I can't remember what language he did speak, but Pali is closer to the language that the Buddha actually spoke. And he seems to have taught in his language rather than using the more esoteric, scholarly, ritualistic language of Sanskrit. So I'll try and when I think of it, use the Pali rather than the Sanskrit. But on the handouts, I'll put both the Sanskrit and the Pali. So that's what I wanted to say about language and a little bit about the sources, which is our earliest sources come from the Tipitaka, from the three baskets of scripture maintained by the Theravada. But I have allowed myself to make use of some of the later stories, some of which are written in Sanskrit, about the Buddha's life, that some might say are more legendary, but the fact that none of this was written down any time near the actual life of the Buddha, you know, just because something has devas in it or things that we might think of as mythic doesn't mean that it's, you know, and another story doesn't mean that the story that doesn't have it is more historical than the one that does have it. But some of the later stories I've allowed because they're just fun, right? I mean, some of these stories about the Buddha are just fun, and even if they're later and not part of that original canon of scripture, they're still enjoyable to tell. All right, so we're going to pick up with 29-year-old Siddhartha, who is married to Yasodhara. And he has now seen he's had these four famous encounters. You remember he encountered the person who was elderly, and he saw a body that has been deformed by age. He encountered a sick person whose body had been ravaged by disease. He saw a corpse, and then he saw a renunciant, an ascetic, someone who had given up the householder life and all the pleasures of that, who knew of old age, sickness, and death, but seemed to have peace nonetheless. And Siddhartha said, that's what I want. I need to pursue this path if I am going to find release from suffering, if I'm going to overcome the suffering that comes with old age, sickness, and death. And of course, not just death, but rebirth and death again, and rebirth and death again. This cycle of samsara. So he decided that this would be his path. Now you have to remember, his father Suddhodana had been trying Siddhartha's whole life to keep him from going down this path by surrounding him by youth, by beauty, by pleasure, and making weaving this illusion around him that there is no suffering in life. But once he saw that there was in fact suffering, he knew he had to abandon that life. He had to awaken from that illusion or that. Now there was one complication, well, a couple. He was married, as we just mentioned, to Yasodhara. So he had a wife, he had responsibilities to his wife. He also had a newborn child, who he had named Rahula, which means fetter, or chain. I heard one person in a documentary refer to it as saying this is like naming your child ball and chain, right? He named his child fetter, or obstacle, because he knew that if anything would keep him from walking down the path of the ascetic and seeking enlightenment, it would be his child. So late one night, when in some texts it says that the Devas had put the whole palace into a deep sleep, all except for Siddhartha and for his servant and chariot driver Channa. Siddhartha went to the bedroom that he shared with Yasodhara, where she was asleep with their child Rahula. And he thought that he wanted to hold Rahula just one last time. But he knew that if he did that, he would awaken Yasodhara. And if she was awake, she and the child would be the only things that would keep him from fulfilling his destiny. The only people who could convince him to stay. And so he doesn't even hold his child this one last time. He decides he must go forward and seek enlightenment. So he leaves with Channa, and on his trusty steed, Kathanka, they leave the palace. And in some accounts, all the palace doors are shut, the gates are closed, there's a big wall, but somehow Kathanka, the horse, is able to run and jump so high that they clear the massive wall and land on the other side. And they go forth, and they finally come to a river. And there, the Siddhartha removes the clothing of a prince, gives it to Channa. He takes on the saffron or the yellow robes, variously described as the robes of an ascetic, or sometimes the robes of a criminal. But anyway, the saffron, the yellow robes, he puts those on, simple robes, gives his princely garb to Channa, tells him to take it back to the palace and burn it, then takes his sword and cuts off his hair, his long hair, as a way of marking the end of his life as Prince Siddhartha and his going forth as an ascetic. Now this is a standard trope. The cutting off of the hair is marking this transition. And when we looked at Jainism, the Mahavira did the same thing when he gave up his life as a householder, as a son of a noble family. Though in their stories, you remember the Jains are always a bit more extreme than anyone else. He didn't cut off his hair, he plucked his hair out with his hands. This will be, you'll see a lot of parallels between the Mahavira and the Buddha. The Mahavira always goes the much more extreme route. The Buddha always finds what he'll call later the middle way. He doesn't quite go as far as the Mahavira, but he cuts off his hair and he enters the life of an ascetic. Channa goes back and burns his robes and tells his family that he has left them. And so it begins his time as a forest dweller, as a wandering ascetic. But he had not been trained to be an ascetic, a yogi, a renunciant, a sannyasin. So he has to learn. He has to seek out a teacher, a guru, to teach him the disciplines necessary for seeking enlightenment. This is something that you don't simply know yourself. You can't simply stumble, at least according to Theravada Buddhism, you never just stumble into enlightenment. You never happen to be sitting in your armchair thinking deep thoughts and suddenly get enlightened. It takes discipline, it takes practice. And so he seeks out the teacher, Alara Kalama, to teach him, the guru Alara Kalama, who has many disciples. This is one of those forest-dwelling ascetics that, are the kind of folks who end up writing the Aranyakas and the Upanishads. One of these kinds of individuals who are practiced in, for example, prana yoga, breathing exercises, and hatha yoga, the physical exercises, and in dhyana, the meditative state, how to do meditation. And it's to this guru that the Buddha goes and learns from him, and learns the basic practices that he will need to complete his quest, to fulfill his destiny. But it's not long before the Buddha, or Siddhartha, not yet the Buddha, has surpassed Alara Kalama at all of these great spiritual practices, these disciplines. Yoga, you remember, is a word similar to our word yoke. So when, for example, Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you," he's saying, take my discipline on, right? Become my disciple. It's the same thing. Yoga means a discipline, to be yoked to a discipline. And Siddhartha takes on the yoke, the yoga, the discipline taught by Alara Kalama, and he masters it in short time, so that he has surpassed Alara Kalama. But what he realizes is, having done all these things, he has not yet found escape, liberation from suffering, from the suffering that comes with the knowledge that things grow old and get diseased and die and are reborn, and grow old and get diseased and die and are reborn over and over again. He still finds that inside of him, his passions are uncontrolled. His desires are uncontrolled. He can still his mind for a time, but when he comes out of it, he still feels these passions, these desires that lead him down the path of suffering. So he leaves Alara Kalama and he seeks out Uddaka Ramaputta. And this is yet another guru. Some sources suggest that Uddaka Ramaputta was a Jain, so not one of these folks that we might associate with the Upanishads and the Aranyakas, but someone we might associate with Jainism. So someone very much focused on, remember, ahimsa, non-violence, and someone whose practices are determined by ahimsa or non-violence. So it would be from him that he would learn, the importance of compassion towards all living creatures, but also learn how to fast for long periods of time. Remember, the Jains, the ultimate way you want to die as a Jain is to cease eating and drinking so that you stop causing harm to any living thing. And so he would have learned how to fast for long periods of time, how to stand or sit still for long periods of time, because remember, again, the Jains don't want to move, because anytime you move, there's the possibility you might hurt or kill some small creature, some little ant or something like that. So he learns from Udakarama Buddha. He becomes so adept at his yoga, at his disciplines, at his practice, that he surpasses Udakarama Buddha and says, but I still have not escaped suffering. I'm still not free from old age, the suffering that comes from knowledge of old age, sickness, death, rebirth, old age, sickness, death, rebirth. And I still have these passions inside of me, these attachments, these longings, these desires that drive me towards this suffering. So he realizes that he has surpassed his teacher, but still hasn't found what he's looking for long before you two ever sang the song. So, what's our time look like, by the way? Time?
It's 22.
Okay. So he leaves his second teacher, and he realizes he's not going to learn from a teacher. What he needs to do, he's not going to learn from a guru. Now, this is a major break, by the way, from what we might think of as Hindu tradition, because in Hinduism, you learn from the guru, you learn from your teacher until you surpass your teacher, and then you are prepared to become a guru yourself, right? But Siddhartha has rejected. He has learned all he can from his teachers and rejected their teaching. And now he goes out and he finds these 5 ascetics in the woods who have no teacher, but are just practicing the most extreme forms of asceticism, starving themselves for long periods of time, doing all sorts of yogic practices that have them contorted in all sorts of ways, walking through briar patches, dipping themselves in the ice-cold river, all these kinds of things as a way of overcoming the self, overcoming the body, overcoming desires and passions. And he joins these 5 ascetics in these practices. And again, he surpasses them. So they're doing the most extreme things, the most extreme forms of ascetic disciplines, the most extreme punishments of the body, and he goes even further. So how many of y'all have seen the fat Buddha? The statues or pictures of the fat Buddha, right? Which isn't actually the Sakyamuni Buddha. That's a later Buddha to come, and we don't need to worry about him. Typically, statues of the Sakyamuni Buddha, he just looks like a normal guy, right? He's not overweight. He's not anything. But you can find statues of Buddha from the Sakyamuni Buddha of Siddhartha from this period of time, where statues, not from this period, but of him at this period in his life, where he is completely emaciated, where he's terribly skinny and his robes are just hanging off of him. It was said that he could put his hand on his stomach at this time and feel his spine. He had starved himself so much. In fact, he got to the point where he had done this so much that he was lying on the ground and he had basically passed out. And people walked by and thought he was dead. But a young girl from a neighboring village came with a little bit of food, and she brought it to him. And he was so famished that when he had the strength to lift himself up, he started to eat the food. And he ate, and he ate, and he regained his strength. And he realized that he had taken it too far. And even after having done this, having taken himself to the extremes of asceticism, he still had suffering when he thought of old age, disease, death, rebirth, old age, disease, death, rebirth. There was still suffering. He still felt these. He had tried to get control of them through these disciplines, but he still felt the passions and the desires in his own heart and mind that were driving him towards this suffering, the attachments. So all he had done is try and suppress them by focusing on not eating and on focusing on punishing the body, but he hadn't actually conquered them. He hadn't found an escape. And it's at this point that he remembered a time when he was a young man, a boy really, and he had been out during the harvest season and had sat under a tree because it was a hot day, just to cool himself under the tree. And as he contemplated the harvest and all the small beings, insects and whatever, animals whose lives were being disrupted, perhaps ended by the harvest, as the ground was torn up, as the plants were taken up. He had gone into a deep sorrow, thinking of their suffering. But then, sitting under this tree, which shaded him from the sun, he moved from his sorrow into a place of peace. He had entered the first stage of the kind of meditation, the jhana, that would bring him to enlightenment, without doing all of this effort, without doing all of these yogic practices or anything, but simply by contemplating with compassion those who are in suffering and then letting it go. And so he realized that it wasn't going to be in extremes of pleasure or wealth, pretending that suffering doesn't exist, that enlightenment would come. He wouldn't escape suffering in that way. But it also wouldn't be in extremes of asceticism, of these disciplines and practices that are harmful to the body, that his enlightenment would come. But he would have to find a middle way. And so he took the bowl from which he had eaten, and he was nearby a stream or a river, and he puts the bowl in there, and he says, if this is the path, then let this bowl flow upstream. And in fact, that's what it did. The bowl flowed upstream. And so he realized that if he was going to seek enlightenment, reach it, fulfill his destiny, he would need to eat and have enough strength to be able to sit and meditate. And so he does. He regains his strength. He regains the vitality he needs. And then he sits in a place that's now known as Bodh Gaya. He sits beneath a tree and begins to meditate. Do we have enough time for me to tell you about him reaching enlightenment? What's our time look like?
We have
You have 2 minutes.
We have to go.
2 minutes. Okay. We're going to do it in 2 minutes. So he sits there beneath the tree, and as he's sitting beneath the tree, meditating, Mara the tempter comes. Now, we haven't come across Mara before, but Mara is, in some sense, seen as the Lord of illusion. And of the suffering that comes from illusion. He is the one who wants to tempt Siddhartha to remain in his illusion, so that his illusions and his suffering, so that he will not reach enlightenment, he won't become awakened and won't be able to teach others and free them from illusion and from suffering. So Mara comes to him, the tempter, and tries to tempt him. He brings before him an army of demons. And the army of demons let loose their arrows at him and seek to attack Siddhartha as he sits silently beneath the tree. But in his meditation, Siddhartha sees past the illusion, and all the arrows turn to flowers. Well, Mara's not going to be stopped, so he brings forth his daughters. And I can't remember, I think his daughters each represent some form of desire or whatever. But essentially they are meant to tempt him to lust. And his daughters come before Siddhartha and try and tempt him towards desire. And Siddhartha in his meditation sees past their youth and their beauty and realizes that they too will grow old, become sick, and will die. And so he is able to overcome that temptation. Finally, Mara says, I have all these demons and devas before me to bear witness to my power of illusion. Who bears witness to you? And takes his hand and touches the earth, and the earth bears witness to Siddhartha that he is the one to overcome Mara, to overcome illusion, and to free the world from suffering. And from there he moves into the stages of meditation until he reaches enlightenment and is awakened. And that's where we'll stop and pick up next week.